There is no map that marks this place, no commercial flight ever landed here, and not a single American was born in this town. Yet if someone had walked its streets on a cold winter morning, they would have sworn it was the United States. Low wooden houses line the main road, each with a white fence in front, street signs written in English, blue mailboxes standing quietly near front porches, a gas station with a familiar logo, a sedan parked beside the pump, as if its driver had only stepped inside. In the morning, the radio played American news programs. At noon, the smell of toasted bread drifted from kitchens. At night, televisions aired the same shows watched by millions of American families. Everything looked right. Everything sounded right. Except for one thing. This town was not in America. It was buried deep inside the Soviet Union. Inside restricted zones, ordinary citizens never entered. And everyone living here, speaking English, eating American food, following American routines, was not American. They were trainees of the KGB. During the height of the Cold War, the KGB built working replicas of American towns, not as film sets, not as propaganda, as something far more dangerous. These towns were designed to transform Soviet citizens into convincing Americans long before they ever set foot in the real United States. And this story is not really about buildings or streets or imported magazines. It is about a human experiment, one that lasted for years, and one whose consequences even the KGB struggled to control. From the beginning, the goal was brutally clear. The Soviet Union needed agents who could live inside the United States for years, even decades, without being exposed. Not short-term operatives, not quick missions, but people who could disappear into American society completely. They would build careers, they would form friendships, they would marry, raise children, and grow old. To the outside world, they would appear entirely normal. The KGB already knew what did not work. Perfect documents were not enough. Fluent English was not enough. Even deep knowledge of American history and politics was not enough. The real problem lay somewhere deeper. It lay in reflex. A person could memorize every rule of American etiquette, yet still reveal themselves in seconds. The way they ordered food, the way they paused before answering a casual question, the way they reacted when confronted unexpectedly. These tiny moments, barely noticeable to most people, were often what exposed Soviet agents. The KGB had lost too many operatives because of mistakes like these, and slowly an uncomfortable conclusion formed. If they wanted someone to behave like an American, they had to live like an American. Not for weeks, not for months, for years. Sending hundreds of trainees to the United States for that kind of preparation was impossible, too risky, too expensive, too visible. So the KGB chose the opposite solution. If they could not bring their people to America, they would bring America to the Soviet Union.
These mock towns were not simple training facilities. They were living communities. Streets, homes, workplaces, shops, bars, churches, everyday American life, rebuilt. Every detail mattered. Street layouts were copied from real American suburbs. Storefronts displayed English signage and familiar brand names. Interior spaces were filled with furniture modeled after American catalogs. Even the placement of household appliances followed American norms rather than Soviet ones. For the trainees, there was no concept of acting. From the moment they entered, English was the only permitted language. No breaks, no private moments to slip back into Russian. Each trainee received a fully constructed identity, a complete personal history that included childhood memories, family backgrounds, education, hobbies, and personal preferences. They didn't merely learn what Americans said, they learned how Americans thought. And that was where the danger began. The longer someone lived inside this world, the less artificial it felt. Old habits faded, new instincts formed, reactions became automatic. The KGB understood this process. They needed it to work, but they also feared it. They feared the strongest trainees might stop being fully Soviet. They might internalize American values, American individualism, and American ways of seeing the world. The KGB faced a paradox. The better the program worked, the more unpredictable it became. And the greatest threat to this operation was not the FBI. It was not American counterintelligence. It was not even exposure. The greatest threat came from inside the human mind.
To understand why the KGB accepted that risk, we have to go back, before these towns existed. Soviet agents kept failing in the United States, not because they lacked skill, but because they could never fully escape who they were. That failure is where this story truly begins. For years, Soviet intelligence could not understand a frustrating pattern. Their agents were not exposed by dramatic betrayals, not by secret documents, not by coded messages, not by confessions. Instead, entire operations collapsed over details so small they seemed almost absurd. An agent would pass every background check, speak flawless English, and maintain perfect cover for months. Then, one day, in a completely ordinary situation, something felt wrong to the people around them. Not suspicious, just off, and that was often enough. The problem was not information, it was instinct. An operative might know what Americans ate for breakfast, but still prepare it differently. They might understand tipping rules, yet hesitate for half a second when the bill arrived. They might answer casual questions correctly, but with a rhythm that felt unnatural. These were not mistakes that appeared on paper. They appeared in moments no one trained for. A grocery store conversation, a joke at the office, a spontaneous question from a neighbor.
In American society, much of daily interaction relies on unspoken expectations. People do not consciously think about them, but they recognize immediately when someone violates them. Soviet agents kept triggering those invisible alarms. One of the most common failures was small talk. In the Soviet Union, conversation was often purposeful. Silence was normal. Long pauses were not uncomfortable. In the United States, silence often feels uncomfortable. Americans talk to fill space. Weather, traffic, anything. They make casual observations. They exchange remarks that carry no real information, but signal friendliness and social ease. Soviet operatives learned the words. They learned the phrases, but they struggled with the instinct. When asked, "How's it going?" many answered too literally. When asked, "What do you think about this weather?" they responded seriously. When someone joked casually, they sometimes failed to laugh at the right moment. None of this sounded dangerous, but it accumulated. Food was another trap. An agent could order perfectly, but how they said it mattered. Tone, speed, casual confidence. Americans ordered without thinking. Soviet operatives often ordered as if they were completing a task. That difference was subtle, but servers noticed it. Regular customers noticed it. And once someone noticed one odd behavior, they began to notice others. Even body language betrayed them. Americans keep more personal space. Eye contact is different. Gestures are looser, less restrained. Soviet agents often stood too close or too far away. They held eye contact too long or avoided it at the wrong moment. None of these actions were suspicious on their own, but together they created a sense of unease. People could not always explain why something felt wrong. They only knew that it did. The most damaging mistakes came from emotional reflexes. American culture rewards personal opinion. Questioning authority is normal. Expressing dissatisfaction is expected. Soviet culture, shaped by decades of centralized power, rewarded caution. Expressing disagreement publicly carried risk. That instinct did not disappear easily. In conversations about work, politics, or daily frustrations, Soviet agents often reacted too carefully, too neutrally, too controlled. To Americans, this sometimes felt unnatural. A coworker complaining about management expected shared frustration. A neighbor discussing local politics expected a casual opinion. An agent who stayed too neutral stood out. Ironically, trying to avoid attention often drew more of it. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Soviet intelligence faced an uncomfortable truth. Their agents were failing, not because they lacked intelligence or discipline, but because they were still Soviet on the inside. They had learned how Americans talked, but not how Americans reacted. And reaction is not something you can memorize. At the same time, American counterintelligence was becoming more sophisticated.
Agencies like the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not rely solely on evidence of espionage. They watched behavior. They observed social patterns. They paid attention to inconsistencies. Often, investigations began with nothing more than a vague report. He's polite but strange. She doesn't quite fit. Something about them feels rehearsed. Once surveillance began, pressure mounted quickly, and under pressure, small cracks widened. The KGB reviewed case after case. Again and again, the conclusion was the same. Language training alone was insufficient. Cultural briefings were insufficient. Even extended stays abroad under diplomatic cover did not solve the problem, because the agents always knew they were visitors. They had never grown up inside American routines. They had never absorbed American habits naturally. They were always performing. Even when they believed they were relaxed, the performance was good, just not good enough.
This realization led to a radical shift in thinking. What if training was not preparation, but transformation? What if an agent stopped pretending and gradually became American? Not ideologically, not politically, but psychologically. What if American behavior stopped being something they recalled and became something they executed automatically, without conscious effort? That question changed everything. It reframed espionage as a long-term psychological process rather than a technical one, and it forced the KGB to accept a disturbing idea. To create the perfect deep-cover agent, they would have to interfere with identity itself. They would have to reshape instincts, overwrite reflexes, and replace an entire cultural foundation. This could not be done in classrooms. It could not be done through lectures or manuals. It required something far more extreme. A controlled environment, total immersion, and time. Lots of time. The decision that followed was not made lightly. It required enormous resources, unprecedented secrecy, and a willingness to accept risks no intelligence service had fully confronted before. The KGB would attempt to do something no other agency had tried at this scale. They would build a parallel America inside the Soviet Union, and inside it, they would begin erasing the line between training and reality. By the early 1960s, the KGB reached a conclusion that was both simple and deeply unsettling. Identity could not be forged on paper. For decades, intelligence services had relied on the same fundamentals: false passports, carefully constructed biographies, accent training, behavioral drills. If an agent memorized enough details, they could survive. But the KGB's internal reviews showed a consistent pattern. Even the best prepared operatives failed over time. Not because they forgot who they were supposed to be, but because under pressure, they reverted to who they actually were. The KGB began to think about espionage in a different way. They stopped asking, how do we teach someone to act American? They asked, how do we make someone stop acting at all? That question changed the rules. Acting requires constant effort. Being does not. An actor monitors everything: words, posture, reactions. One mistake can expose everything. But a person who has internalized a behavior does not think about it. They respond instinctively, automatically. The KGB wanted agents who no longer needed to remember how Americans behaved, because the behavior had become natural. This realization forced Soviet intelligence to confront a dangerous truth. The problem was not skill, it was culture. Culture shapes reflex long before conscious thought appears. It determines what feels normal, what feels strange, and what feels wrong. And culture is not learned quickly. It is absorbed over time.
Children absorb it unconsciously. Adults resist it, often without realizing they are doing so. The KGB understood that to overcome this resistance, they would need to control the environment completely. No reminders of home, no cultural shortcuts, no safe mental space to retreat to. Only immersion. They studied how identity forms, national and personal, how habits form, how routine shapes thinking, how repetition erases self-awareness. They examined the difference between knowing something and living it. And the conclusion was unavoidable. If they wanted agents who could survive indefinitely in the United States, they would need to raise them, psychologically, inside an American world, even if that world was artificial. At the same time, pressure was increasing from the other side. American counterintelligence agencies, particularly the Central Intelligence Agency, were becoming more aware of long-term infiltration strategies. While much of the public focused on dramatic spy cases, intelligence professionals understood that the real danger lay in agents who blended in perfectly. The Cold War was shifting. Espionage was no longer about stealing single documents. It was about positioning, influence, patience. And patience favored those who could remain invisible the longest.
Inside the KGB, debate turned intense. Some argued the plan was too risky. Years inside a false culture could destabilize people. Agents might lose loyalty or defect once exposed to the real thing. Others argued the opposite. They believed loyalty came from discipline, not identity, that a properly trained agent could adopt foreign behaviors without adopting foreign values. Both sides were partially right and partially wrong, but strategic necessity outweighed hesitation. The KGB had to adapt or fall behind. The plan that emerged was unprecedented. Instead of preparing agents for America, they would simulate America itself. Not a simplified version, not a symbolic version, but a detailed, living reconstruction of everyday American life. This environment would not be used for demonstrations or short-term exercises. It would be a place where people lived for years, where routines replaced lessons, where habit replaced memory. Instructors would not simply teach, they would participate. They would maintain American identities at all times. They would speak only English. They would behave exactly as Americans did, every day without exception. There would be no off-duty moments.
The trainees were carefully screened, intelligent, stable, adaptable. Above all, chosen for their ability to disappear. People who did not attract attention. People who blended easily. People whose personalities could be reshaped without obvious resistance. Once selected, they were removed completely from normal Soviet life. Families were cut off, previous careers erased, old identities archived and sealed. What replaced them was something entirely new. The KGB understood that this process would be irreversible. Once someone lived too long inside this artificial America, they might never fully return to their previous self. Even if they remained loyal to the Soviet state, their inner world would change. But from the KGB's perspective, that was acceptable, because an agent who could survive decades inside the United States was worth any cost, even the human one. Construction of these towns began quietly. Locations were chosen for isolation. Access was tightly controlled. Supplies were carefully managed. Everything that entered the towns was monitored. Everything that left them was restricted. What emerged was something surreal, a place that looked American, sounded American, felt American, and yet existed entirely for deception, not of the enemy, but of the people living inside it. The stage was set. The experiment was about to begin.
The location mattered as much as the idea itself. These towns could not exist near real cities. They could not sit close to rail lines or civilian roads. They had to be invisible, physically and psychologically. Isolation was not a side effect. It was a requirement. The sites were chosen deep inside restricted zones, often in harsh climates where few people ever traveled. Distance reduced curiosity, cold reduced movement, and secrecy reduced risk. Once construction began, the outside world disappeared. The goal was not landmarks, no skyscrapers, no monuments, no famous buildings. Instead, planners focused on something far more important: normality. They studied suburbs, not cities. They copied forgettable places, because forgettable places are where people stop paying attention. Single-family homes, wide streets, parking lots, shopping strips, the kind of environments people passed through every day without noticing details. Construction teams worked from thousands of reference materials, photographs of American neighborhoods, videos of street intersections, catalogs showing furniture layouts, even supermarket floor plans. Everything had to feel right at a subconscious level. If a street was too narrow, it would feel European. If buildings were too close together, it would feel Soviet. If signs were placed incorrectly, something would feel off. The designers obsessed over spacing, angles, and proportions. They were not building a set. They were building a behavioral trigger.
Inside the homes, the same philosophy applied. Rooms were sized to American expectations. Kitchens followed American layouts. Living rooms were arranged around televisions, not dining tables.
Refrigerators opened the wrong way by Soviet standards, but the right way by American ones. Electrical outlets were placed exactly where Americans expected to find them. Even the sound mattered. Doors closed with the right weight. Floors creaked in the right places. Appliances hummed instead of rattled. These details were not cosmetic. They trained instinct. Outside, the streets completed the illusion. Traffic signs followed American conventions. Crosswalks looked familiar. Fire hydrants were placed at regular intervals. There were sidewalks wide enough for casual walking, lawns trimmed to a specific height, fences that existed more for appearance than function. Nothing felt defensive. That was deliberate. In the Soviet Union, architecture often communicated authority and control. In these towns, architecture communicated comfort and routine. The message was subtle but powerful. You are safe here. Relax. Public spaces were built with purpose. Diners taught small talk at the counter. Bars taught social drinking without looking like a stranger. Churches were there for familiarity, not faith. Religion in the Soviet Union had been suppressed for decades. Many trainees have little understanding of it. But in America, religion was woven into community life. Even if an agent never attended church in the United States, they needed to understand how it worked, how people behaved inside it, what they said afterward, how it shaped social relationships. So churches were included.
Workplaces were built as well. Mock offices, workshops, administrative buildings. Inside them, trainees practiced American workplace culture. Meetings, casual disagreement, office humor, informal hierarchies. Instructors corrected mistakes in real time, not through lectures, but through social feedback. A wrong tone, an awkward pause, a reaction that felt too stiff. These were addressed immediately, not as errors, but as habits that needed replacing. One of the most important design choices was consistency. The illusion never broke. There were no visible Soviet symbols, no Russian language signs, no reminders of where the trainees really were. Even support staff adopted American personas. Everyone inside the town stayed in character at all times. If someone slipped, even accidentally, it was treated seriously, because one crack could weaken the entire structure. The KGB understood that humans adapt faster than they realize. If you wake up every day in the same environment, your brain stops questioning it. The unusual becomes normal. The artificial becomes familiar. And familiarity breeds automatic behavior. That was the true purpose of the towns, not to convince the trainees consciously, but to convince them unconsciously. As months passed, routines formed. Mornings began the same way. Work followed predictable patterns. Evenings settled into familiar rhythms. Trainees stopped thinking about how they were supposed to act. They just acted. And that was the moment the experiment crossed a line. Because at that point, the towns were no longer training facilities. They were environments capable of reshaping identity. The KGB had created something extraordinary and something dangerous. At first, trainees noticed everything: streets, houses, voices, movement. They were alert, cautious, constantly reminding themselves that this place was not real. But the human mind does not stay alert forever. That was exactly what the KGB was counting on. Training did not begin with lectures. It began with routine. Each day followed a predictable rhythm. Mornings started at the same time. Breakfast looked the same. Radios played the same kind of programming Americans heard before work. The voices became familiar. The music faded into background noise. No one announced lessons. Life itself was the lesson. Work assignments were deliberately mundane. Some handled paperwork in mock offices. Others worked shops, garages, or service counters. The tasks were not intellectually demanding, and that was intentional. Complex tasks kept people self-aware. Simple tasks allowed habits to form. Instructors observed quietly. They did not interrupt unless something truly stood out. Most corrections happened indirectly. A raised eyebrow, a casual comment, a joke made at the trainee's expense. Social pressure replaced formal discipline. Language training changed shape as well. Early on, instructors corrected grammar and pronunciation, but that phase ended quickly. From that point on, the focus shifted to rhythm, tone, and timing. How long you paused before answering, how much emotion you put into a sentence, whether your response sounded rehearsed or spontaneous.
Trainees learned that being correct was not enough. They had to sound natural.
Meals played an unexpected role. Food was not just consumed, it was discussed. People talked about preferences, about restaurants, about things they liked or disliked. These conversations seemed trivial, but they trained something critical: opinion. In the Soviet Union, expressing personal preference publicly was not always encouraged. In American culture, it was constant. What do you like? What do you think? What would you choose? Trainees had to answer without hesitation. Over time, they stopped thinking about what their answers should be and started responding instinctively. That was progress. Entertainment was treated the same way. Evenings were not free time. They were immersion time. Television shows were selected carefully, not just popular programs, but the kind of content that shaped everyday references: sitcoms, commercials, sports broadcasts. Trainees absorbed humor, timing, cultural references. They learned when to laugh, when not to, what jokes required explanation, and which ones never did. This knowledge could not be taught directly. It had to be lived. Sports became a major focus, not because everyone loved sports, but because American men often used sports as social currency. An inability to follow basic conversations about teams or games could isolate someone immediately. Trainees watched games together. They discussed scores. They argued casually. Instructors paid attention to reactions. Did someone cheer too late? Did someone celebrate the wrong moment? Did someone fail to react at all? These mistakes were subtle, but they mattered.
Over time, something changed. Trainees stopped translating in their heads. They stopped planning responses. They stopped monitoring every gesture. English became automatic. Body language loosened. Conversations flowed. The towns did what they were designed to do. They removed friction. Months passed, then years. The environment stayed the same. That stability was critical. Human beings adapt to consistency faster than to intensity. The longer something stays the same, the more normal it feels. Eventually, trainees stopped thinking of themselves as practicing American life. They were simply living it. This was the moment the KGB both wanted and feared, because once routines became unconscious, they could no longer be switched off at will. Some trainees began dreaming in English. Others found it difficult to recall Russian words quickly. A few struggled when brief contact with Soviet administrators broke the illusion. The artificial world felt more real than the outside one. Psychologists attached to the program monitored these effects closely. They watched for stress, for confusion, for emotional instability. Most trainees adapted well. A few adapted too well. They became comfortable, relaxed, at ease in ways they never had been before. And comfort was dangerous, because comfort weakened the mental barrier between role and self. The KGB accepted this risk for one reason. An agent who lived comfortably as an American would not draw attention. They would not stand out. They would not hesitate. They would not think. They would simply react. And reaction, not knowledge, was the difference between survival and exposure.
But this success created a new problem. The more natural the trainees became, the harder it was to measure loyalty. And loyalty, once questioned, could never be taken lightly. The experiment was working, but it was also changing the people inside it. Buildings alone could not sustain the illusion. Streets did not teach tone. Furniture did not teach instinct. Routine did not teach emotion. People did. And the most critical element of the program was not architecture. It was the humans assigned to live inside it. The instructors were not traditional teachers. They did not stand in front of classrooms. They did not correct mistakes with red ink. They did not announce authority. Instead, they inhabited the town. They worked the counters. They sat at the bars. They argued about sports. They complained about traffic. To the trainees, they were neighbors, co-workers, and friends. To the KGB, they were instruments. These instructors were selected with extreme care. Most had lived in the United States for extended periods. Some had worked under diplomatic cover. Others had studied abroad or interacted closely with Americans for years. They understood American behavior at a level that went beyond textbooks. More importantly,
They could perform it effortlessly. That effortlessness was what the trainees needed to absorb.
But the most unusual members of the program were not Soviet officers at all. They were Americans, or at least former Americans. Some were defectors who had crossed to the Soviet side for ideological reasons. Others were disillusioned expatriates who had grown bitter toward the United States. A few were individuals whose personal circumstances made cooperation attractive. Their value was not ideological, it was behavioral. They did not need to pretend. They did not need to remember. They simply were American. That authenticity was impossible to replicate artificially. These Americans played a delicate role. They were not told everything about the trainees' future missions. They were often given partial explanations, framed as cultural consultation or language immersion. Their job was to behave normally, to complain about mundane things, to express opinions casually, to react emotionally without calculation. They argued loudly, they laughed openly, they expressed frustration without fear, and in doing so, they taught more than any manual ever could. The presence of real Americans created a powerful feedback loop. Trainees subconsciously adjusted themselves to match them. Speech patterns aligned, humor shifted, body language softened. When a joke landed, trainees felt it immediately. When it fell flat, the silence taught its own lesson. Correction did not come from authority. It came from social consequence. The instructors monitored everything, not in obvious ways, not with constant supervision. They listened, they watched, they remembered. A trainee who avoided casual disagreement was noted. One who reacted too cautiously to criticism was observed. One who struggled to express personal preference was flagged. These observations were compiled quietly. No one confronted the trainee directly. Instead, the environment was adjusted. More exposure, more interaction, more pressure. The Americans involved in the program often noticed the difference, even if they did not understand the reason. Some commented that the trainees felt